It is a privilege, it is an honor for me to open this conference and to join you in exploring this conversation on reparations and debt justice. To open this discussion, I would like to share a reflection that I have titled Justice, Reparations and Transformations. Africa responds to a world in turmoil. And I would like to begin by asking you a question. Have you ever had a conversation with a friend, a family member, or a colleague about colonization, and then the main argument was, shouldn't we just move on? For me, I heard it so many times. A friend saying, you know, it's been 60 years, 70 almost, since independence, it's time to move on. We can't just play the victim forever. We need to move on. For me, it's almost like a refrain. I hear it among Africans on the continent, Africans in the diaspora, among Europeans, among people in the global north. Everyone seems to say it and to say it to Africa. In this keynote, I would like to speak to you about 3 points that I think are crucial into this conversation. I would like to start by saying that this constant call to move on is dangerous. It blinds us. It prevents us from seeing the neo-colonial systems of violence that was born out of decolonization and that is still at work today. It prevents us from naming the harm that continues to wound Africa. To say, let's move on, it's not neutral. It is to turn away from the structures of exploitation that are still shaping our lives and are still blocking the path toward justice. The second point that I want to make in this presentation is that if we truly want to confront Africa's contemporary challenges, whether it's climate justice, debt injustices, gender injustices, the disruptive power of new technologies, then we need structural transformations. Structural transformations that are guided by reparative justice. Our institutions are still marked by colonial domination, and they cannot give us justice. They cannot offer us fair answers, neither for us, nor for the generations to come. And the third point of this presentation will be to invite you to embark on this journey of reparations, of reconstruction through reparative justice. It is a journey that calls us to move beyond defeat and denial, to begin dismantling colonial structures, and to rebuild systems rooted in our knowledge, in our cultures, in our economies, and our dignity. Before I begin, I would like to clarify this concept of reparations. Because as it has been said earlier, reparations are not simply about financial compensations. They are not only money handed over. The International Human Rights Framework has recognized that reparations can take multiple forms. Restitution, financial compensation, rehabilitations, guarantees of non-repetition. But this is a bit too narrow. I see reparations more as in a holistic approach, including these different components, but most importantly, as a project that involves dismantling structures of violence and rebuilding systems that are fair, that are equal, and that uphold the dignity of Africans and people who have African descent. I see reparations as a political project. As I mentioned a few moments ago, we have fallen to this blinding, dangerous denial and defeatism. We tell ourselves that colonization is over, and that our African leaders, and we the people, are solely responsible for the current challenges, for the failings of this continent. Yet, decolonial scholars urge us to make a crucial distinction, a distinction between colonization and coloniality. Colonization refers to this historical process in which foreign powers, mostly Europeans, occupied, dominated, and exploited directly territories and peoples, starting from the 15th century. Coloniality refers to the ongoing logics of domination, hierarchy, and power established by colonialism even after the formal end of colonization. One of the decolonial scholars, Ramon Rofagel, says the global structures built by colonial capitalism over 5 centuries did not simply vanish with 50 years of juridical and political decolonization. We are still living under the colonial matrix, a colonial matrix of power. We have moved from an era of global colonization to an era of global coloniality. Another decolonial scholar, Sabelo Ndlovu Gacheni, says the post-colonial world and the new African humanity that was expected to lead the struggles for independence has been captured by neo-colonial imperatives. The insights of these decolonial thinkers also echo powerfully the words once spoken by the great leaders of independence. Because the leaders of independence struggles warned us of the most insidious system to which decolonization has given birth to. Foremost in my mind is Kwame Nkrumah. In his book, The Last Stage of Imperialism, he explained the logics of the neo-colonial system. He says, the essence of neo-colonialism is that the states which is subject to it is in theory independent and has all the outward trappings of international sovereignty. In reality, he continues, its economic system and thus its political policy is directed from outside. According to Nkrumah, neocolonialism is also the worst form of imperialism. For those who practice it, it means power without responsibility. And for those who suffer from it, it means exploitation without redress. In the days of old-fashioned colonialism, he continues, the imperial power had at least to explain and justify at home the action that it was taking abroad. It's not the case anymore. What I found very interesting in this quote from Nkrumah is that he exposes in the more insidious way in which neo-colonialism operates. It is no longer held accountable, and the colonized are left without no avenue to demand justice. And I would like to add to his argument that imperial powers, in addition, disseminate narratives according to which they are helping us to develop. They are helping us in our crisis. Sankara too spoke of the dangers of neocolonialism, focusing particularly on issues of debt. In one of his speeches, he said, debt is neocolonialism. Is neocolonialism in which colonizers have transformed themselves in technical assistants. We should rather say technical assassins. He continues, Under its current form, controlled and dominated by imperialism, debt is a skillfully managed reconquest of Africa, intended to subjugate its growth, development through foreign rules. In this way, I continue to read his speech, each one of us becomes the financial slave, which is to say a true slave of those who had been treacherous enough to put money in our countries with obligation for us to repay. End of quote. What is interesting here is that Sankara shines a light on a new form of violence that neocolonialism uses. It's not physical violence anymore. It's not political violence anymore. It operates through the guise of technical assistance. The point I want to make here is that we cannot simply move on. As the mothers and fathers of independence, along with the decolonial thinkers, have shown, colonial structures survived colonization. They merely took on new forms. The violence is transcontinental, is global. The violence is diffused through technical instruments. Another important point to remember about the decolonization process is that at its core, it was a profoundly unjust process. Why? Because instead of giving reparations to African people, to states, those whose resources were plundered and whose bodies were exploited, it was given to foreign states. It's foreign states who received compensation. European states profited from the very process of decolonization. Take, for instance, the case of DRC. At independence, DRC was forced into debt, paying the equivalent of 200 million of US dollars of today in reparations to former colonial actors who were in DRC. DRC was also forced to pay a debt contracted by the colonial administration. A debt contracted from the World Bank, the equivalent of 150 million US dollars. This pattern was repeated elsewhere. When Zimbabwe gained independence, it inherited a debt of $700 million, contracted not by its people, but by the colonial administration that had ruled over them. But it was not only states that profited from this distorted decolonization. Private corporations did it as well. As Anthony Ange has shown, many multinational corporations exploited the weakness of newly independent states to demand compensation. And international law, which offered no such avenue at the time, was later reshaped to make this possible. Meanwhile, the demands for justice and reparations voiced by Africa itself were ignored. Consider, for instance, the call for a new international economic order. As many of you know, the new international economic order, often referred to as the NEO, was a bold set of proposals put forward by developing countries through the United Nations. Their vision was clear: to revise the international economic system in a way that truly served the interests of developing countries, rather than continuing to uphold the Bretton Woods system. African states may not have used the word reparations, but the essence of their call was unmistakable. They were asking for justice. They were asking for equity in the governance of the global economic system. We could take another domain, the restitution of looted artworks. Today, it is estimated that 90% of Africa's cultural heritage is held outside of Africa. 90%. That amounts to more than 1 million items. These objects were not lost by chance. They were systematically taken during colonial era, seized through military raids or punitive expeditions. But Africans didn't remain silent. Demand for reparations began almost immediately after independence. As Felwine Sarr and Benedict Savoy remind us, from the 1960s through the mid-80s, countries such as Ghana, Madagascar, Nigeria, Senegal, Tanzania, and the DRC expressed their claims to Belgium, France, Britain, and Germany. The results, however, were limited. Some temporary loans were granted. Very few permanent returns took place. To conclude this first part, I would like to say that we cannot look at the period of decolonization simply as a moment that set us free. Because the truth is, it did not end the story of domination. On the contrary, it gave rise to other forms of violence, forms that were less visible, perhaps more subtle, but just as destructive. What are these new systems of violence? I would like to start by giving the example of the climate crisis. Scientific reports have made it clear. The roots of the climate crisis lie in the extractive process of colonialism. So the climate crisis is not the disease, it is the symptom. The true disease is colonial capitalism. Africa has contributed little to global emissions, less than 4% of carbon emissions. Yet, we bear the brunt of its consequences. We are paying the highest price in terms of natural disasters, in terms of floods, in terms of droughts, in the erosion of our biodiversity, in the devastation of our lands. We are paying the highest price at a human level. Projections warn that by 2030, 50 million Africans could be pushed below the poverty line, while 100 million risk being displaced from their homes. We are paying a high price economically. It is estimated that the continent loses between 5 and 7 billion US dollars each year in addressing the consequences of this crisis. Worse still, in order to help the countries of the North confront the climate crisis, our populations are being stripped of their lands, of their forests, of their water, even of our wind, so that the North can secure the technologies that it needs to build electric batteries, solar panels, green hydrogen. This is what is now called green colonialism, as we see it embedded in so many called green deals. We perish, they prosper. Let us imagine for a second what an alternative to this situation could be. In an Africa freed from colonial violence and truly repaired, we could be receiving reparations from the states and corporations that destroyed our ecosystems, plundered our resources, and profited from our exploitations. We could benefit from climate reparations, funds, but also technologies, so that we could adapt to the changing conditions. and respond to the disasters. In fact, scholars such as Fanning and Jason Hickel calculated that rich, polluting countries are liable to pay a climate debt to vulnerable, low and lower middle income countries of the equivalent of $107 trillion. But that is not what is happening. Instead, the very states that have benefited from this climate crisis are offering us loans. They ask us to go into debt to face a crisis that we did not create. As if our situation of over-indebtedness were not enough, they pile on even more loans. So today, 71% of climate finance flowing to Africa is in the form of loans. So I use this example to show that even the formal process of colonization has ended. We are still enduring the consequences. And not only we are forced to take loans to confront those very consequences, but we are compelled to give away our own resources so Europe feel less the impact of the climate crisis. The debt situation, as it has been explained multiple times, is no less alarming. 22 African countries are in debt distress or in high risk of debt distress. Almost 57% of the continent's population live in countries that spend more on servicing external debt than on education, on healthcare. And as you know, this over-indebtedness worsens the situation of vulnerable demographics, particularly women. The recent report published by Nawin AfCoDD shows that budget cuts in social spending, such as education and healthcare, shift the burden of care onto households. Budget cuts increase unpaid care work, primarily for women and girls. They intensify their domestic and reproductive responsibility, deepening inequality and vulnerability. And again, we have to understand that the root causes of this crisis are embedded in the system of colonial capitalism. I would like to give two examples related to debt. Most international loans and bond issuance are placed under foreign legal jurisdictions, typically in financial centers like London and New York. So this choice of jurisdiction is not neutral. The choice of legislation is not neutral. It systematically privileges creditors. So there is no equal sovereignty among countries in international economic law. The second example that has been mentioned on multiple occasions before is that low-income countries pay higher interest rates when they borrow money in comparison to wealthy nations. Take, for instance, the case of Germany. It can borrow money at just 0.8 interest rate because it considers a safe investment. But some African countries are forced to borrow at rates as high as 9.8. That is more than 12 times the rate of Germany. Let me be clear. The debt crisis is not a disease. It is a symptom. The real disease, it is the system that created it. It's a system of colonial capitalism. You will recall that in the early 2000s, thanks to the Jubilee campaigns, the world came together to grant a debt relief. Oh, thank you. The world came together to grant debt relief to the mostly heavily indebted nations. Yet, Just 20 years later, the global debt crisis is even more severe than it was before. Why? Because we have built mechanisms that treat only the symptoms. We address the pain for a moment, but we never cure the illness. And so, a few years later, the crisis returns. Let us imagine once again where we will be if we were in a repaired Africa, an Africa free from colonial structures. We will not have to repay the debts of colonial administrations. We will not be bound by loan contracts subject to Western laws and courts. We will not have to negotiate debt through institutions like the IMF or the World Bank, where our voices are barely count. In the International Monetary Fund, for instance, a British person's vote is worth 23 times more than a Nigerian's vote. In this repaired Africa, we wouldn't face pressures to adopt reforms that contradict our own socio-economic priorities, creating discontent and fueling political instability. I make this detour to remind us that since independence, we have lived through endless cycles of crisis and in a permanent state of denial of justice. And I dare to believe that this is not simply about some intrinsic inability to govern, but rather the result of conditions deliberately created to prevent our liberation. Given this context, the question I ask myself and the question I ask you, are we going to let this system of colonial violence spread quietly? Will we just stand by, especially now when a new world order is being reshaped? We know that leaders around the world are working to reshape a new global order. Remember the words of Mia Mottley at the UN General Assembly last year, who urged world leaders to reset the system. Global powers are indeed competing, each trying to impose their own solutions. So solutions that risk deepening our vulnerabilities and imposing new forms of violence. We saw this with Donald Trump. Our response cannot be yet another superficial reform, another incomplete project like the one we were handed during decolonization. This time, it must be structural transformation. In this sense, the declaration by the African Union of the Decade of Justice and Reparations for Colonial Injustices could not have come at a more opportune moment. At a time when the international order and Africa's relations with the global north need to be reconfigured, we cannot afford to fall into defeatism or denial. We cannot ignore the system of colonial violence and exploitation that continued after independence. We cannot ignore the extraction and exploitation of Black bodies carried out through economic, social, environmental crises and the development of new technologies. We need to address contemporary crises through the paradigm of reparations. If we truly want to confront Africa's contemporary challenges, whether it's climate change, debt crisis, gender injustices, new technology, we cannot avoid reflecting on the colonial violence that has shaped us, that has shaped our states and institutions over the last 6 centuries. This doesn't mean erasing or denying the responsibility of our governments, the responsibility of our civil society, of our judges. It means sharpening our understanding of the responsibilities behind Africa's struggles. It doesn't mean returning to some romanticized pre-colonial Africa, imagining as if it were free of flaws and contradictions. But we must begin by making efforts to break free from the colonial and decolonial structures that make this crisis possible. This work of deconstruction requires, above all, dismantling the myth of decolonization, the myth that led us to believe that we have gained true independence, when in reality, it was the birth of yet another system of violence. It requires deconstructing the narratives that claim that international aid and international development system, with institutions, with its actors and ideology, will inevitably lead to development. We must free ourselves from colonial epistemologies that make us believe that these crises are solely the result of our own failings. However, it's not only about deconstructing structures, as Sylvia Tamal reminds us. Africa must think beyond mere deconstruction. Sylvia Tamal says, the agenda for decolonization and decolonial activism must involve reconstructions that focus on reclaiming our humanity, rebuilding our territorial and bodily integrity, reasserting our self-determination, restoring our spirituality, dismantling the material and symbolic foundations of the colonial capitalist states, decentering Western hegemonies of knowledge and cultures regarding race, gender, and sexuality, and embracing the Ubuntu philosophy grounded in the principles such as interconnectedness of all things. She continues, above all, our Africanness, our womanness, our subversive agency must be celebrated. As Sylvia Tamal reminds us, we must embark on a process of reconstruction, transformative reconstructions, transformative reparations. A reparative approach that honors our cultures, celebrates our languages, and uplifts our epistemologies. Ultimately, it's about continuing the unfinished work of our grandmothers and grandfathers who fought for our liberation. It is our responsibility to carry forward this unfinished political project of liberation. As members of civil society, as scholars, as policymakers, as actors from the private sectors, the task falls on us. We must look at our strategy of actions and ask, to what extent do they uphold the dignity and values of our fellow citizens? We must look as researchers to our research programs and ask, to what extent do we continue to privilege knowledge systems that are not our own, instead of uplifting the African epistemologies? As policymakers, we must look at our political programs and ask, to what extent do they affirm the humanity of our brothers and sisters across the continent and abroad? Ladies and gentlemen, reparations are not a single act. They are not a one-time demand. Reparations are, above all, a political project. A project to which each one of us can and must contribute at every level. It is a work of deconstruction and reconstruction. It is a claim to dignity, our own, the dignity of our ancestors, and the dignity of future generations. It's a project to rebuild Africa and to restore the dignity of its people. It is, in the truest sense, a political project to repair Africa. Thank you.